I think the best place to start, because I'm an author and I have to be creative every now and again, is to start in medias res. So in the middle of things in the 1950s. Now, some people might say, "Oh, wait, 1950s, that was like a golden age for the family. It's like this wonderful, fantastic time." No, it wasn't. And let me explain to you what I mean. The 1950s get glorified and they get brought up as nostalgia. Like, oh, it's this great time of entertainment and this great time where, mom and dad and kid were all together in the house and, Beaver Cleaver and, oh, that was the 60s. But, the Andy Griffith Show and all that. 1950s were so great, even though that was also like 1960 when that show started. But anyway, the 1950s were so great and so wonderful, and Father Knows Best and all that. They really weren't all that great and wonderful. They did a good job of putting up a front of being great and wonderful. But you don't really have to peel back too much of that onion to find the stinky part. So the 1950s, family life of the 1950s, is probably best summed up with suburbia. Suburbia is a post-World War II invention where, people don't really want to live in the city anymore because it's crowded and noisy. But people don't really want to live in the country because of whatever reasons. It's, farm animals are smelly and it's, too far to go to your neighbor's house. You want to live in the city. You also want to live in the country. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to create a solution with a system. Because that's what the 1950s did. They had a system or a scientific solution for everything, which there isn't a scientific solution for everything, but that is another topic for another podcast, or a different aspect of this particular era that will be discussed sometime later down the road. But basically, the suburbs arise after the Second World War, and the Second World War and the GI Bill, which says that if you served active duty in the military, then the military will pay for you to go to school, which is still a thing today. The Army and the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, even the Coast Guard, I think they all will say stuff like this, or they'll all mention this. And then it even extends into the National Guard. Like if you're in the National Guard, the Army will still pay for you to go to school, at least in some states, if not anywhere. But anyway, so here in the U.S., riding on a high of the Second World War, because we like to think that we won both world wars entirely by ourselves, we create the suburbs, which are supposed to be this utopian ideal, is of the best of both worlds, of the city and of the country. And, there are these mini communities they just pop up everywhere, where it's, there's a bunch of houses and a bunch of neighborhoods. Oh, and there's a school right there, and there's a supermarket, and everything is just right there for you, and it's super convenient. Because, again, convenience being another hallmark of the 1950s. Everything has to be as convenient as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to one of the downsides of that later on, too. The problem with that, and with how they were advertised, and even with how they were practiced, is basically the suburbs create sterility. Is where it's like, oh, every house and every family is the same. They got the mom and the dad and the three kids, the two boys and a girl, or the two girls and a boy, or whatever it is, and they got the white picket fence out front, and this is the American dream. But under the surface, there's a little bit more going on. Just a little bit worse things going on. Because the generation that built this is the one that we call the greatest generation and the greatest generation before them. They are a generation that is broken by a half century of war, famine, and pestilence. So if you were 50 in 1950, you have conscious memory of the First World War, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl, and the Second World War. We forgot to mention the Dust Bowl earlier. Basically, that's when the entirety of the southern Midwest became a giant barren wasteland full of nothing. Dirt and sand, dust, dead trees, dry bushes, hardly any water. And that happens around the same time as the Great Depression and just thereafter.
Yeah, it's not weak-willed. It's not pithy to understand that when the world is ending in your eyes, there's a lot of trauma that can come from that.
Yeah.
And for them, like, the world is ending. And then it nearly ended again. And then it nearly ended again. And then it nearly ended again. And then potentially again. At least 5 times.
There were what they thought were potentially world-ending catastrophes, or at least catastrophes that were death to their own personal world and their own personal sphere of everything that you could see. Because most of this was also before the invention of television, and all you could actually see was what was literally right before your eyes. Or in a photograph. You know, they got their news through the radio. So...
And their news is going to be events of the outside world, because they're not going to need local events to be told through the news, because
you're talking to your neighbor about your local events.
Yep.
So if you're a farmer and you look out your front door and there is no water and no crops are growing and the trees are all gone because the railroad came through and cut down every single tree so they could lay as much rail as possible, and industrial farms started and destroyed, and industrial farm equipment is way more aggressive, or at least back then it was way more aggressive than hand tools, so it kicks up a ton of dust and chokes the land. Yeah, that's not going to be fun.
Nope.
So I understand why after the Second World War there's something of a high. Like, because we won the First World War, and then we had the Roaring 20s, which were like a happy 7 years. Until 1929, and then there's a stock market crash, and then everything is depressing again. Everything's sad, everybody's poor. On top of that, nobody can even drink. But we'll get to prohibition later on.
Oh, yeah. The alcohol rant is coming.
This is more a lot of this is more what I was intending for the second, so we'll go a little bit deeper into it for the next part next week. But basically, the greatest generation and before were broken as human beings.
And when you're broken you don't make good decisions.
Broken minds, broken bodies, broken spirits. And that is not a good time to suddenly try to create an ideal. Because when you're broken inside, you try to create something that doesn't have anything resembling a flaw, especially because this is a country founded by Puritans and just has a natural cultural tendency to Puritanism, where everything has to be perfect and exactly this way, or it's wrong, or it's bad, or it's sinful. But here's what the creation of the suburbs does, and this is why I don't like the suburbs at all.